Welcome. Take a moment to settle in. Let your body become still. Whether you're listening to drift softly into sleep, or to lose yourself in the quiet current of the past, you're in the right place. Tonight, we'll be traveling back to Tudor England, a time of velvet gowns and wooden spoons, of queens and court intrigue, but also of chamber pots and thatched roofs. And specifically, we'll be tracing the path of marriage, not the fairy tale kind, but the real, layered, and often burdensome experience of being married off in a world where love was rarely the point. In the 1500s, marriage was less a romantic milestone than a transaction, a shift in property, alliances, and household labor. It was a time when daughters were bargaining chips, sons were expected to advance family name, and affection was, at best, a distant hope. Tonight's journey unfolds in 4 parts. We'll begin by stepping into your shoes, imagining you, a young girl of perhaps 14 or 15, preparing for your marriage. We'll sink into the textures of daily Tudor life and the quiet weight of duty. Then we'll learn about Catherine Howard, the ill-fated 5th wife of King Henry VIII, a girl not much older than you might have been, and what her life and death reveal about courtship and control in Tudor times. From there, we'll drift into the strange world of wedding rituals and cultural customs, the symbols, the silks, and the curious practices that made a marriage both sacred and strategic. Finally, we'll glimpse what life was like for those in power. How queens, duchesses, and wealthy heiresses navigated their marriages in a world that watched their every move. So, close your eyes if you'd like. Let your breath slow, and let's begin our journey. Imagine yourself, not as you are now, but as a girl living in a modest manner in the English countryside. It's the early spring of 1534. The morning air is damp with mist. Your linen shift clings to your skin from the cold, and the stone floors of your home are unforgiving beneath your feet. You are 15 years old enough, they say, to be married. Your parents, respectable, though not noble, have made arrangements. The man is older than you, perhaps in his late 20s or 30s. He is neither cruel nor kind. He is a match, and that is enough. You've seen him only once or twice, perhaps during a feast at Michaelmas or from the back of a cart. He did not speak to you directly. He negotiated with your father. Your marriage is not about affection. It is about land, or wool, or a position in someone's household. It is about honor. This morning, your mother is inspecting the dowry chest. Linen sheets, a few silver spoons, and a Bible. Precious things that you will take with you to your new home. Your trousseau includes chemises carefully stitched by your hands. You've been sewing them for months. You will also bring a mortar and pestle, a cooking pot, some herbs dried on the rafters of your kitchen, perhaps a hand mirror, if your family is particularly well off. The marriage contract is being written in the hall beside the hearth. A notary from the village is drafting it. Your father is discussing your future as if you are not in the room, which you are not. You are upstairs, scrubbing your hands raw with soap made from lye and ashes, preparing for the fitting of your wedding kirtle. Your wedding will be small. A priest will bless the union. There will be no grand procession. Perhaps some bread, a jug of ale, a small joint of meat if the spring has been kind. But before the ceremony, there are duties. You must pack your things. You must memorize the creed in case the priest asks you. You must be quiet, obedient, pure. No one asks how you feel. In truth, it is not expected that you feel much at all. Later that evening, by candlelight, your mother tells you how to behave, how to care for your husband, how to serve him meals, how to remain silent when uncertain. There is talk of your first night together. It is brief, vague, wrapped in euphemism. You do not ask questions. The next day, the marriage is made. You are no longer a daughter in this house. You are a wife in another. The journey to your new home takes half a day by cart. Your new house is not so different, except that everything is unfamiliar. The kitchen smells different. The dog growls at you. Your husband expects dinner at dusk. He does not speak much. He nods when you enter. He shows you where to sleep. The bed is high off the ground. Stressed, you lie still. The beams above you are covered in spiderwebs. The candle sputters out. You are now a woman. Outside, the owls call. Inside, silence. You will rise before the sun tomorrow to boil water, bake bread, and learn how to manage a home you did not choose in a life you had no say in entering. And so begins the rhythm of your days, a constant struggle, a constant silence, a role played without question, because that is what has always been done. As we continue our gentle journey through the quiet shadows of Tudor history, let us now turn our attention from the broader world of domestic expectations to the life of a single woman. Her story, though centuries old, echoes with the faint strain of heartache, endurance, and the quiet resilience often demanded of noble women in her time. Her name was Elizabeth Stafford, born into one of England's most powerful families. Her father was the Duke of Buckingham, and her bloodline wound tightly through the branches of the English aristocracy. Yet, despite her noble birth and the trappings of influence, Elizabeth's life was marked not by grandeur, but by a long bitter marriage, filled with silence, separation, and sorrow. She was married off like so many others, not for love, but for alliance. Her husband, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, was many years her senior. He was a man of ambition and authority, deeply entrenched in the politics of Henry VIII's court. To the outside world, it was a respectable match, a strong union between two powerful families. But within the walls of their home, the union was something else entirely. You can imagine her waking each day to a household ruled more by tension than tenderness. Elizabeth, intelligent and opinionated, clashed bitterly with her husband. She accused him of violence, of cruelty, of forcing her to live apart from their children. Thomas, in turn, claimed she was difficult, too outspoken, too proud. Their disputes spilled beyond their home. Elizabeth eventually wrote letters to Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, detailing her treatment and begging for help. She accused her husband of living openly with his mistress, of banishing her to a distant estate, and of cutting off her financial support. But Tudor law was not designed to protect a wife in such a position. There were no easy divorces, no recourse for emotional suffering, and so Elizabeth remained married, legally bound, for decades. Isolated, powerless, yet still tethered to a man who had long stopped pretending to be her husband. Still, she persisted. In a world where silence was expected, Elizabeth continued to speak through her letters, her protests, and her unwavering refusal to fade quietly into the background. And so we remember her not just for her suffering, but for her endurance, for her willingness to put into writing what so many women of her time were forced to endure in silence. Her voice, though faint now, lingers as a quiet echo of all the Tudor women whose lives were shaped by marriages they did not choose. As you lie there, letting this story settle softly around you, imagine the slow passage of time in Elizabeth's secluded home, the stillness of days without purpose, the dim candlelight of long evenings passed alone, the creak of footsteps in halls she had come to know too well. Her story is not one of drama, but of the slow, dignified resistance of someone who knew the world would not change for her, and yet chose to leave behind her truth anyway. Now, let us gently shift our attention from the life of one woman to the artifacts and echoes of the era itself. We'll explore the quieter mysteries buried beneath the surface of Tudor marriage through the lens of archaeology, culture, and forgotten customs. As we drift deeper into the folds of history, let us turn now from people to objects. For in the quiet corners of old manor houses and beneath layers of earth unearthed by archaeologists, lie the small, often overlooked remnants of matrimonial life in Tudor England. Perhaps no item better captures the silent expectations surrounding marriage than the humble marriage chest, also known as a hope chest or dowry chest. This simple piece of furniture was, in truth, anything but simple. For a young woman in Tudor England, it represented a lifetime of preparations, stitched linens, folded garments, household tools, religious books, and sometimes small charms or relics, all nestled within. It was both practical and symbolic, a container for necessities and a vessel for her future. Picture it now, a wooden chest, oak or walnut, its surface carved with leaves, lions, or family crests. Inside, a collection of handmade items gathered over the course of years, often by the woman and her female relatives. Each piece was folded with care, scented with dried lavender, and laid to rest in the chest as a testament to readiness. This chest would travel with her to her new home. There, its contents might be scrutinized, not for their artistry, but for what they signified. Were the linens fine? Were the stitches straight? It was not merely a bride's belongings. On this plate was her value quietly appraised. But the chest was only the beginning. Marriage rituals in Tudor times were rich with symbolism. Some were deeply rooted in Christian ceremony. Others were local traditions, passed down without written record. For instance, the ritual of hand-fasting, symbolic tying together of the couple's hands with ribbon or cloth, was a holdover from older times. It lingered even as formal church weddings became the norm. You might hear of plighting one's troth, a phrase that meant pledging faith, often done months before the actual wedding. And then there were the household charms bundles of herbs placed under beds, rings blessed at churches, little tokens sewn into the hem of a bride's shift. These were quiet assurances, whispered attempts to protect a young woman entering a new world, one in which she had little control. Even the language of marriage contracts was a ritual of its own. Dowries were negotiated in careful detail, often long before affection ever entered the arrangement at all. Cattle, coin, and land were exchanged. In some surviving records, a bride is never even named only referred to as the daughter of, or the niece to. These were transactions wrapped in the thin veil of ceremony. And yet, there was beauty in these customs, too. A carved ring, a shared cup of spiced wine, a bridal procession lit by flickering torches. There were moments of brief light in what was often a long road ahead. Archaeologists today still uncover wedding tokens, rings with Latin inscriptions, fragments of lace, or portraits in miniature. In some church walls, names were etched quietly with knives, just initials and dates, barely legible now, but meaningful then. These are the echoes we listen for, the small evidence of joy, hope, and intention that once accompanied young women into uncertain futures. As you breathe gently now, imagine yourself in a chamber warmed by rushlight and hearth. A chest at the foot of the bed, its contents quietly telling the story of a life prepared, a journey begun, but never guaranteed. And from there, we shift once more, from the brides and their burdens to those who lived at the opposite end of Tudor society. In our next and final segment, we'll drift into the world of noble estates and courtly love where marriage was both a performance and a political act. Now, let us move from the quiet hearths of modest homes to the echoing halls of grand Tudor manors, from oaken chests and homespun linens to velvet cloaks, stained glass, and the hum of distant lutes. Here, among the nobility, marriage was not just a personal rite, it was an instrument of statecraft, a binding contract not only between individuals, but between families, fortunes, and political futures. Picture the scene: a banquet hall washed in candlelight, its tall windows open to the garden air. At the high table sit to figures a young noblewoman in brocade, her hair arranged with pearls, and beside her, the man to whom she is now betrothed. She may have spoken to him only briefly. Their match arranged by fathers, uncles, or even monarchs. To be born into the Tudor elite was to enter a world of high stakes and higher expectations. Love was never the priority. Strategic marriages ensured the transfer of estates, the forging of alliances, and the safeguarding of family names. And for women, there was little room for choice. A noblewoman's value was calculated in lands, lineage, and her ability to bear heirs. Her upbringing was carefully curated to prepare her for a courtly life. She learned languages, dancing, embroidery, the art of conversation skills designed not for personal fulfillment, but for presentation, for suitability. If she were fortunate, she might be wed in her mid to late teens. Often, she was younger. Her husband might be decades her senior, with lands to secure and a family name to extend. The wedding itself was a grand affair. Gilded garments, feasts of roasted game and marzipan, elaborate processions. There would be musicians, jesters, embroidered banners, a priest presiding in Latin over ornate vows, all under the gaze of those who had negotiated the union long before the bride herself was consulted. After the ceremony came the bedding ritual, public and uncomfortable by modern standards. Witnesses might accompany the couple to their chamber, ensuring the marriage was not only celebrated, but consummated. This act, though intrusive, was considered necessary to validate the union and any future inheritance. And then, the daily rhythm of noble marriage began. A life of public performance and private restraint. A woman navigating her household's affairs, overseeing servants, maintaining social ties, walking always within the bounds of obedience and appearance. Some marriages were quietly companionable. Others were cold. Affairs, though unspoken, were not uncommon, particularly among the powerful. Yet the structure remained intact. The outward harmony of the marriage served the family first. But it was not only women who bore this burden. Young noblemen, too, were often married off to girls they barely knew. Their futures charted not by desire, but by dynastic need. In Tudor England, love, if it came at all, was something to be managed, sometimes hidden, and often sacrificed. And yet, within these rigid confines, people still sought connection. Letters survive, scribbled notes, hidden verses, tokens passed in corridors. In rare cases, affection bloomed after marriage. Even at the Tudor court, glamorous, glittering, perilous marriage remained a game of survival. Courtly love was performed with poetry and flowers, but true autonomy was rare. As we draw toward the close of this journey, allow yourself to drift once more. Imagine a bride walking down a stone corridor, her footsteps soft on rush-strewn floors. Behind her, the echoes of her old name. Ahead of her, a life she did not choose but must now endure gracefully. She adjusts her veil. She enters the hall, and the doors quietly close behind her. Next, we ease into our final moments of reflection, a gentle conclusion to gather what we've seen and settle ourselves in the present, far removed from the silence and ceremony of Tudor matrimony. Tonight, let your thoughts drift through time, not to the grand halls of kings or the cathedrals of saints, but to a quieter, hidden corner of the medieval city, a place marked by whispers, candles, and footsteps in the dark. It is here, in the brothels of medieval Europe, that we begin our journey. This is not a tale of scandal or titillation. There are no rose-tinted illusions here, only a gentle exploration of what it truly meant to live, work, and survive in one of society's oldest and most misunderstood professions. As you settle into rest, we'll walk you through the unvarnished routines, quiet moments, and the seldom spoken difficulties that defined the lives of those inside these establishments, not only the women who worked within them, but the keepers, servants, and even the clients, shaped by the structure of a brothel's daily rhythm. Let the world outside fall silent for a while, and come with me calmly, curiously, into the inner workings of a medieval brothel. The day did not begin with the rising of the sun, but with the fading of it. Imagine yourself waking not to birdsong, but to the soft scrape of footsteps on the stair, the muted creak of wooden floors, and the low rustle of linen being pulled from a shared pallet. The room is close, warm, and filled with the scent of oil lamps and bodies. Bathing was rare, but wiping down with a damp cloth, cold and rough, was a quiet ritual. Your clothes, plain but practical, might hang beside the bed. A chemise, perhaps dyed faintly, with threadbare sleeves. If you were lucky, a clean apron and a comb. There was no rush to breakfast. A heel of bread soaked in yesterday's broth, a sip of watered wine, maybe a scrap of salted meat. Meals were humble and eaten quickly in the corner of the shared hall. Silence wasn't expected, but voices were hushed, preserving energy for the night ahead. If you were under the control of a brothel keeper, your schedule was strict. There were tasks assigned during the daylight hours: sweeping, mending, tending to linens, or preparing the rooms. The interiors were spare but serviceable mattresses of straw, walls lined with faded cloth, a small table set with pewter or wood. The air smelled faintly of herbs, often lavender or rosemary, meant to cover less pleasant odors. Privacy was a luxury. Rooms were divided by curtains, not doors. Sound carried easily: steps, laughter, arguments. But over time, you learned to tune them out. What mattered more was rhythm, knowing when to be ready, when to retreat, and when to pretend not to hear at all. The first clients might arrive by mid-afternoon, though most came later, under cover of night. You learned to read them quickly. Were they drunk or quiet, young or old, kind, indifferent, or cruel? It wasn't always clear. Your earnings were rarely yours. A portion, sometimes most, went to the brothel keeper. Some women worked for coin, others for room and board. A few were indentured, repaying debts they could never truly clear. Protection from the law was uncertain. In some cities, brothels were tolerated, even taxed. In others, they were punished, shut down, or moved from one quarter to another. You learned to live with ambiguity, ever sure whether the town watch would turn a blind eye or drag you into the cold streets for public punishment. And yet, despite it all, there was camaraderie. Quiet alliances between women who shared stories, combed each other's hair, and warned each other of danger. Moments of laughter between tasks. The small comfort of a warm hand or a knowing glance in the dark. By the time the last lamp was extinguished, the night was well spent. Tomorrow would begin again roughly the same, perhaps with a new bruising ache, a stolen moment of kindness, or an unexpected visit from the bishop's men. It was a life balanced on the edge of society, where dignity was constantly negotiated and safety was never promised. And yet, this too was history. This too was survival. And so ends this day in the brothel. Now that we've walked quietly through the daily routine of a working woman in the medieval brothel, let us shift the lantern's light toward a single figure, one whose life intersected power, wealth, scandal, and the brothel's hidden world. Her name was Alice Keitler, a woman of privilege and position, yet forever tangled in rumors of poison, sorcery, and the shadowy commerce of the flesh. Born in Kilkenny, Ireland, in the late 13th century, Alice was the daughter of a Flemish merchant background that offered her both wealth and an early education in trade. She married well, and then married again and again. In fact, Alice would outlive 4 husbands each, of whom, according to whispers, died under curious circumstances. But what truly set Alice apart from other women of her time was not just her wealth or her string of spouses. It was the way she defied the expectations placed upon her. She owned property, she ran businesses, and in the records of the time, there are hints that one such enterprise may have involved the management of an establishment, not unlike the brothels we've just explored. Of course, the terminology used in the documents is careful. Women, like Alice, rarely confessed directly, but inns with private rooms, homes with steady male visitors, and profits drawn from the discretion of others, all added to the murmurs that clung to her name. Her 4th husband, Sir John Le Poer, became ill. He complained of strange powders and dark potions, of being bewitched, as it was put. When he died, his children from a previous marriage accused Alice of poisoning him and consorting with demons. They took their claim to the bishop. What followed was one of the earliest known witchcraft trials in Europe. Alice was charged with heresy, sorcery, and blasphemy. The list of accusations included animal sacrifice, black magic, and speaking with a demon named Robin Artisan, who, according to her accusers, visited her in different forms, sometimes a dog, sometimes a man. The bishop was determined. He gathered clergy and pressed for Alice's imprisonment. But here is where her power truly showed. Alice had influence, money, and friends in high places. While her maidservant, Petronilla, was tortured and publicly flogged, forced to confess to impossible crimes, Alice vanished. She fled, most likely to England, leaving behind a tangle of mystery, outrage, and legend. She was never caught. And though the records fall silent after her flight, her story echoes across the centuries, not only as a tale of persecution, but of a woman who lived on her own terms in a world that allowed women very few. To some, she was a noble woman turned criminal. To others, a victim of envy and superstition. But beneath all that, perhaps she was something simpler, still a sharp mind in a dangerous world. Surviving with the tools available to her. Property, position, and a veil of discretion. And like so many who lived at the edges of respectability, her truth remains just out of reach, drifting in shadows, waiting quietly, as history so often does, for someone to listen. As we leave behind the narrow path of Alice Kittler's life, we turn now toward something older, broader, less a person than a place, or rather, set of places that existed in quiet contradiction. Picture yourself walking along the south bank of the River Thames, just outside the ancient walls of medieval London. The year is somewhere around 1350, and the air hums with the rhythms of the city. The thud of cartwheels on stone, the cries of street vendors, the soft lapping of the river against the wooden piers. This district is known as Bankside, and here, in an arrangement that to modern ears might sound paradoxical, the church has granted official sanction to a row of brothels known as the Stuza word that, Lisa, referred to bathhouses and later became a quiet euphemism for houses of prostitution. The Church of England, through the Bishop of Winchester, actually owned this land, and instead of banning the practice outright, they chose to regulate it. That's right, religious authorities leasing property to brothels. Why? Part of it was geography. Bankside was technically just outside the legal reach of the City of London, giving the bishop a degree of independence in what he allowed. A part of it, too, was practicality. Prostitution, while condemned in sermons and doctrine, was acknowledged as an inevitable feature of urban life. Better, it seemed, to control it than to let it fester in secrecy. The stews were governed by strict rules that, on parchment at least, created a strange kind of order to this illicit world. No woman could work there who was married. No man of the cloth could enter. No one could be forced or held against their will. And, curiously, no brothel could be open on religious holidays. All of this was codified in the ordinances of the stews, a legal framework created in the 15th century to manage and monitor the businesses along Bankside. Of course, what was written and what was enforced were often two very different things. Still, archaeologists today have uncovered fragments of this world, bits of pottery from communal kitchens, the remains of wooden latrines, even shards of hand-blown glass that once held oils and perfumes. The layout of the buildings, many with separate rear entrances and unusually thick inner walls, hints at discretion and secrecy. There were signs, too, that clients could rent not only the company of women, but hot baths scented with herbs, food, music, and drink, a carefully curated atmosphere meant to seduce the senses while soothing the mind. In a strange way, these stews became not only places of vice, but of hygiene and relative luxury, especially for those who could afford more than the bare minimum. Yet the contradiction remained. The church profited, the women endured, and society, as it often does, looked away. In time, the tide turned. By the late 16th century, moral reformers began to clamp down harder. The brothels were officially closed by 1546 under the reign of Henry VIII, who had his own turbulent history with both religion and the regulation of personal behavior. But the remnants of that time, of that strange illegal and moral gray zone, linger in the records and the ruins, in every crumbling foundation and scorched ledger book. There is a whisper of that forgotten world where sin was taxed, pleasure was managed, and the line between piety and profit blurred beneath the surface of everyday life. As we leave the shadowed alleyways of the stews behind, we cross a subtle but striking threshold, from the working poor to the world of silk, gold, and careful performance. It is here, in the ornate halls of noble estates and candlelit chambers behind courtly walls, that we encounter another figure of intrigue, the courtesan. She is not a brothel worker, nor quite a noblewoman, but something in between, companion to the wealthy, the powerful, and the ambitious. She is educated, refined, and fluent in more than one language of persuasion. In her world, appearance is currency, wit is survival, and discretion is paramount. While lower-class sex workers were often dismissed or demonized, courtesans, particularly in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts of Italy, France, and the Low Countries, occupied a curious position. They were, in some cases, patrons of the arts, advisors to nobles, and keepers of dangerous secrets. In Venice, for instance, the cortegiana onesta, the honest courtesan, might entertain ambassadors, compose poetry, or recite classical philosophy. Her presence at social events was not scandalous, but expected. She dressed finely, lived richly, and was, in a way, her own brand of elite. Yet hers was no easy life. Behind the velvet gowns and gilded fans lay the same vulnerabilities that haunted women of all classes: dependency on male favor, the constant threat of aging out of value, and the ever-looming judgment of society. In Tudor England, the divide between courtesan and mistress could be paper-thin. The royal court was no stranger to whispered affairs. Kings and nobles often surrounded themselves with unofficial companions, some of whom, like Anne Boleyn, would rise perilously high before falling even further. Here, power was the game, but intimacy was the field upon which it was played. For noble women themselves, the experience could be just as complicated. Marriage, as we've seen, was rarely about love. It was an exchange of land, titles, and influence. In many noble households, wives were expected to endure their husbands' infidelities quietly, even while maintaining perfect moral conduct themselves. To defy that script by taking a lover, by asserting independence, could lead to scandal, imprisonment, or worse. Yet some did so anyway, carving out quiet freedoms in the margins of courtly life. The contrast with the women of the stews is stark. One lived by ritual and reputation, the other by coin and necessity. Yet both played roles that were shaped by men, regulated by law or custom, and framed by a society that saw women's value in terms of their relationships to others. Still, within those confines, some women, courtesans, noble mistresses, even queens, found space to maneuver. They wielded influence with subtlety, wielded beauty as strategy, and navigated treacherous social terrain with remarkable resilience. Their stories, though often softened or scandalized in retellings, remind us that the boundaries between power and vulnerability were never fixed. They shifted with time, status, and fortune, and even in the glittering halls of the elite. Survival was a performance, one where the stakes were as high, and the rules just as rigid as in the dim back rooms of Bankside. As we gently step away from the flickering lanterns and whispered intrigues of medieval Europe's hidden corners, we find ourselves turning toward a very different world, one shaped not by cathedrals or castle halls, but by courtyards of silence, poetry written on silk, and rituals that echo across dynasties. Now, let us travel eastward across oceans and centuries to a place where love was not merely a feeling, but a structured art form. In ancient China, romance was rarely left to chance. Instead, it unfolded within a web of tradition, Confucian duty, and family honor. It is here, behind paper screens and under moonlit pavilions, that we'll explore what it truly meant to court, to be betrothed, and to marry not for passion, but for legacy. This is not a tale of fleeting glances in a tavern or impulsive liaisons behind a curtain. This is a story of arranged unions, secret exchanges, and careful navigation of social harmony, of fans opened to reveal affection, of letters folded with care, and of destinies chosen by parents long before two young hearts ever met. So settle in once more, let the quiet rhythm of a distant zither guide us across time, as we begin our next journey into what courting was really like in ancient China. You're invited on a journey soft, steady, and rich with quiet fascination into a world far removed from our own. A world where love and marriage were not left to chance, not ignited by fleeting emotions or impulsive whims, but rather cultivated like a careful gardener, ranged and bound by generations of tradition. Tonight, we explore the gentle, complex dance of courting in ancient China world, where poetry was a form of flirtation, where fans concealed glances of affection, and where matchmaking was not just a family concern, it was a social obligation, a sacred duty. But this was also a time of quiet rebellion and private yearnings, hidden between the lines of Confucian codes and within the folds of ceremonial garments were subtle hopes, personal dreams, and the timeless question, can love truly bloom under rules not your own? So, as you nestle into comfort with your eyes perhaps growing heavier, let your mind drift slowly into the past. We begin not in the palace halls or among nobles, but within the quiet rhythm of everyday life, where the path to marriage began long before two people ever spoke a word to each other. Imagine yourself in a quiet village in the early days of the Tang Dynasty. The morning light filters through paper windows, soft and diffuse. The air is cool and still, filled with the scent of steamed rice and ink. You are young, perhaps 15, old enough that the idea of marriage is no longer abstract. It is approaching, inevitable. But unlike today, you have no say in the matter. Really. Your parents, especially your father, carry the responsibility and the power of arranging your future. It begins not with a date, but with a matchmaker. Often an elderly woman with a deep knowledge of family networks and local gossip. She holds immense influence. She arrives not with flowers or compliments, but with a documenta, babishua, formal proposal detailing names, birth dates, social rank, and the 5 elements associated with your astrological profile. Compatibility isn't just a hope, it's calculated. If your elements clash fire and water, for example, the match is off, you are not consulted. Your feelings are neither expected nor required. If you're a girl, you've been trained since childhood for this moment to be quiet, obedient, skilled in household duties. Your dowry has been quietly building for years: silks, tea sets, combs, and fine paper. If you're a boy, you've studied relentlessly, not for love, but for honor. Passing the imperial exams means a better match, a better bride, and a stronger family name. Now imagine the day your engagement is announced. You've never seen the other person. Perhaps you've only heard whispers, but the deal is struck. There will be no romantic walks, no getting to know one another. Contact between you is forbidden. If you're caught exchanging even a letter before the wedding, it brings shame. Instead, communication must be indirect. A fan left at a certain angle. A poem shared anonymously. A red string tied outside your window. The pressure is constant expectations from your family, your clan, your community. A misstep doesn't just reflect on you. It stains the honor of those around you. So the courtship, if it can be called that, unfolds in shadows and symbols. You may daydream, you may wonder, but you never choose. And when the wedding day finally arrives, the bride wears red, not white, symbol of joy, but also of formality and fate. Her face is hidden beneath a veil. She is carried to the groom's house, often in silence. Only then do the two truly meet, ain't. Not as strangers exactly, but not as lovers either. This is the quiet truth of ancient Chinese courtship, deeply ritualized, strictly controlled, and often endured more than enjoyed. Still, within these rules, there were moments brief and tender where connection bloomed. A glance, a gesture, a line of verse shared on a scroll. And so, while the system was rigid, the people within it were human. always quietly longing, always quietly hoping. Let that image rest with you as we now move from the daily rhythm of ordinary lives to the extraordinary life of one woman who managed to carve out her own destiny. Now, let us shift gently from the quiet courtyards and arranged alliances of the common home to the refined salons and poetic salons of the Song dynasty. Let us meet a woman whose voice, penned in ink, still echoes through the corridors of timely Qingzhou. Born in 1084 into a family of scholars and officials, Li Qingzhou was not a typical woman of her time. Her father, a respected literary figure, ensured she was educated in the classics rare for a girl. She learned to read, to write, and most notably, to compose poetry. And poetry, in Song China, was more than art, was conversation. It was culture, it was seduction. Li Qingzhou wrote in a tone that was elegant, but intimate melancholy, but alive. Her poems were soft in voice, yet vivid in detail. The rustle of silk sleeves, the hush of late autumn rain, the ache of waiting for a lover who did not come. When she married Xiao Mingcheng, a fellow scholar and art collector, it was by all accounts a marriage of deep intellectual companionship. They built a life around books, scrolls, and antiquities. Together, they compiled volumes on bronze, inscriptions, and poetry, even as the world around them shifted with war and unrest. Their courtship was unlike the norm, filled with shared pursuits, collaborative writing, and long discussions beneath the lamplight. But this fragile world did not last. The Jin invasion of the north forced the couple to flee, leaving behind their precious collection. They traveled in exile, poor and displaced, their former comforts reduced to memory. Her poetry from this time became darker, more haunting. She wrote of loneliness, of loss, of longing for the days when wine was shared and scrolls were read together in peace. Yet even in sorrow, her voice remained strong. She defied convention in widowhood, refusing to remarry for many years despite immense social pressure. When she finally did, her second husband proved violent and abusive, so she did something nearly unheard of for a woman in that era. She divorced him, a radical act. Her life became a mirror to the strict rituals of Song society that revered structure, hierarchy, and conformity. Yet she, in her quiet way, slipped between the lines. She used poetry as a form of emotional freedom. Through her verses, she told the story not only of her own heart, but of the delicate tensions between duty and desire, form and feeling, in a world that expected silence from women. And through the centuries, her words endured, copied, remembered. Today, scholars still recite her lines in the original Chinese, still marvel at the way she captured the tremble of a heart in just a few brushstrokes. Li Qingzhou reminds us that even within a system designed to control courtship and marriage, love could still find its way through ink and metaphor, that even the quietest voice, if written with truth, can outlast empires. Let us now follow that thought into the shadows of history, where symbols and silences meant more than words, and where the rituals of love took strange, beautiful forms. A world of paper charms, ghost marriages, and ancestral bindings. Let us explore the mysteries next. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine a red paper effigy. It sits upright in the corner of a modest hermit's head bowed, its face painted. Around it, offerings of food, incense, and clothing are arranged with delicate precision. But this is not for the living. This is a wedding for the dead in ancient China, especially during the Han Dynasty and through regional customs lasting well into later dynasties. There existed a peculiar, haunting practice, ghost marriage, also known as Minghan. This was the ritual of marrying to deceased individuals, or, in some cases, a living person to the dead. Why? Because in many traditional Chinese beliefs, especially among rural families, marriage was not just a social milestone, was a spiritual necessity. It wasn't enough to die and be buried. One needed to be married to be truly complete, even in the afterlife. A son who died unmarried might bring bad luck or remain restless, unable to fully enter the spirit world. A daughter who passed unmarried was a soul untethered, a spirit without proper place. So families would search through mediums, matchmakers, or signs for a suitable match, sometimes years after death. Some ghost marriages were symbolic. Effigies paper figures representing the bride and groom would be dressed, blessed, and wed in carefully arranged ceremonies. In other cases, bones were exhumed and reburied together, often with new grave markers bearing both names. There were even documented cases where living women were married to deceased men, usually to preserve family alliances, inheritances, or out of filial duty. In such unions, the living woman would become a sort of widow at the altar, living with the groom's family, often taking a vow of celibacy and adopting the life of a ghost's wife. These women were praised for their loyalty, for their sacrifice. Yet imagine the quiet of such a life. No husband to converse with, no companionship, only the echo of ritual. She would burn incense for a man she never met, bow at ancestral shrines, and take her place in a household where no wedding feast had ever truly been shared. This practice, while deeply unsettling to the modern eye, was not seen as morbid. It was an act of continuity, binding families, soothing spirits, restoring harmony, and it reveals something fundamental about ancient Chinese notions of love and obligation. Love, in these traditions, was less about passion and more about placement. Less about connection between hearts and more about connection between ancestors. The matchmaking, then, wasn't always driven by attraction or choice. It was a web of duty, cosmic order, and symbolism. Paper marriages, silent vows, offerings to unseen companions. These were all part of a world where life and death blurred, and where the heart's fulfillment was often measured not in happiness, but in harmony. To this day, ghost marriages still occur in certain regions, rare, and often shrouded in secrecy. Sometimes they are uncovered by archaeologists who find male and female bones interred together, dated from centuries apart. In the hush of a tomb, the story of a match, perhaps made long after death unfolds without words. Let us now return from the realm of spirits and secrets and walk into another courtyard. This time, not of the humble or spectral, but of the elite. The halls of noble families where young women were trained in poetry and posture, and where young men rehearsed their lines of love beneath embroidered lanterns. Let us now explore courtship behind painted screens. Imagine yourself walking through a grand courtyard, shaded by curved eaves and red lacquered pillars. The air is fragrant with sandalwood, and the murmur of zithers echoes from a chamber nearby. In this world, love wears embroidered shoes and speaks in poetry. For the sons and daughters of China's noble and elite families, love was an art formatically choreographed, deeply coded, and rarely spontaneous. In dynastic courts and wealthy estates, courtship followed the rhythm of ritual, aesthetic, and decorum. The young woman of such a household would be trained from an early age not only in music and calligraphy, but in restraint. She learned how to lower her eyes at the right moment, how to pour tea just so, how to answer in verse rather than plain speech. Her words, her posture, even her silence carried meaning. For her love might arrive not with a confan, painted with plum blossoms or inked with a line of Tang dynasty poetry. A folded fan could serve as a message both veiled and deliberate. A fan left behind by a visiting scholar. A silk sash returned with a poem stitched along its hem. These were not mere gestures. They were bold acts in a world of subtlety. Young men, usually scholars or aspiring officials, courted, not with flowers, but with verse sometimes exchanged during poetry gatherings, temple festivals, or through the invisible hands of servants. The romantic ideal in elite circles was not passionate abandon. It was refined affection expressed through intellect and poise. The great romances of classical Chinese literature reflect this. Take, for instance, the Peony Paviliona Ming Dynasty play about a girl who falls in love with a man she sees in a dream. and wastes away with longing, only to be reunited with him beyond death. Such stories weren't simply tales of love, they were odes to destiny, harmony, and the belief that deep feeling must still bow to structure. In reality, elite marriages were still arranged, driven by status, horoscope readings, and family negotiations. But within those constraints, a unique form of emotional negotiation could bloom in understanding between husband and wife, a shared language of glances and gestures, poetry and protocol. Some noble couples found affection within marriage. Others lived lives of polite distance, separated by social duties and emotional boundaries. And still, others, especially men, sought companionship elsewhere. Through concubines or courtesans skilled in music, conversation, and charm. But even those liaisons were governed by rules, formal introductions, carefully measured gifts, and public discretion. You can imagine the interior world of a woman who wrote poems to a man she had met once at a lantern festival, who burned her writings so they would not be discovered, and who perhaps cherished his calligraphy more than his presence. Was delicate as rice paper and just as easily torn. It was no less real. The traditions of elite courtship in ancient China may seem restrained, distant, or overly ceremonial to modern eyes. But to those who lived them, each gesture was weighted with emotion, tradition, and longing. A letter slipped into a sleeve, a poem read by candlelight, a sigh behind a beaded curtain. These were the quiet expressions of hearts tethered by formality, but not silenced by it. As we leave behind the palace corridors and silk screens, let the hush of that world remain with you. In the quiet stillness of the night, perhaps you can hear the echo of an ink brush, the rustle of embroidered robes, or the faint whisper of words never spoken aloud. Let us now draw this journey to a close, gently reflecting on all that we've uncovered. As we leave behind the soft-spoken subtleties of silk fans and whispered verses in ancient China, let us travel now to a very different world, one of marble columns, public spectacles, and relentless social ambition. Whereas love in imperial China might have been composed like a delicate poem in ancient Rome, it was more often performed like a political speech. Because in Rome, romance wasn't always about emotion, was about power, reputation, and survival. Courtship was loud, strategic, and often startlingly transactional. And yet, it still had its own strange elegance, one forged in the forums, shaped by law, and whispered behind draped togas. So imagine yourself walking the cobbled streets of Rome, the scent of wine and olives in the air, the rustle of stola and tunic on every corner. This is why you wouldn't survive a Roman courtship, and it begins not with roses, but with rules. Tonight, we'll drift back into the stone-lined streets and colonnaded courtyards of ancient Rome, not as an emperor, not as a soldier, but as someone experiencing one of life's most universal and quietly complex rites of passage: courtship. But unlike today, courtship in ancient Rome wasn't driven by love or mutual discovery. It was a careful negotiation, status, and family interests, far more than personal preference. In this gentle journey through time, we'll explore what it truly meant to seek a partner in Roman society. We'll begin with the everyday realities of what it was like to be young and eligible in this ancient empire. Before we move through a fascinating historical romance, uncover a cultural mystery, and finally, explore what courtship looked like for the Roman elite. So get comfortable. Let your breath slow. Let the flickering oil lamps of ancient villas light the corners of your imagination. We begin right where most Roman courtships did, with the quiet pressure of expectation and the endless rhythm of duty. The air is dry and warm. The cobbled roads uneven beneath your sandals. You are young, perhaps not yet 16, but already your future is being decided not in whispers of affection, but in stern conversations behind closed doors. In ancient Rome, courtship was not a time of discovery. It was an obligation, something to be endured, often arranged without your consent. Marriage wasn't about personal happiness. It was about legacy and alignment. A family affair, quite literally. If you are a girl, you've been watched closely since childhood, trained to be demure, modest, and marriageable. Perhaps you've learned how to spin wool, manage servants, and keep a household. These are your tools. Not poetry, not music, not charm. And if you are a boy, the expectations are no softer. You must appear respectable, politically promising, and financially stable, qualities you may not yet possess, but are required to project. Imagine sitting at the edge of your family's atrium as your parents meet with the family of your future spouse. The room smells faintly of olive oil and beeswax. No one asks what you feel. That would be out of place. Your duty is to nod, to obey, and to prepare. Even among the lower classes, where marriages were sometimes more casual, courtship remained a public concern. Reputation mattered. A poorly timed visit, a jest taken the wrong way, or a rumor spoken in the marketplace could ruin an entire match. There was no private dating, no midnight walks. Everything was observed, arranged, and supervised. Privacy was scarce. Personal choice was rarer still, and for women especially, time was short. The ideal age for marriage was considered somewhere between 12 and 14. A girl who reached 20 unwed was considered nearly impossible to match. Weddings themselves were symbolic transfers of power ceremonies, less about love and more about shifting a woman from her father's household to her husband's authority. The bride wore a vivid orange veil, the flammeum, and her hair was parted into 6 sections by a spear. It was tradition rooted, not in beauty, but in legacy and control. And after the ceremony, the real work began. Managing a household, bearing children, navigating family politics, all while maintaining the virtue that your family's name now rested upon. Now imagine that you're not interested in this path. Imagine you're drawn to someone inappropriate, freedman, a widow, a foreigner, the consequences, scandal, disinheritance, or worse. The Roman laws on marriage were strict, particularly for the upper classes. Certain unions were forbidden outright. Senators, for example, were legally barred from marrying actresses or prostitutes, no matter how genuine the affection. And if a marriage dissolved, divorce was legal, but reputation was fragile. A woman with multiple divorces risked being labeled infamous, socially discredited, even if no fault was hers. The constant, measured rhythm of Roman life pressed on, carefully, relentlessly. You may have dreamed of romance, of letters passed in secret or glances stolen during festivals. But in Rome, the stakes were too high for whimsy. To court was to calculate. To love was to risk. And to survive it, all without power or protection or choice, was no small task. You wouldn't last a day. Let us now turn from the crowded forums and shadowed alleyways of ordinary Roman life to the quiet tragedy of a woman born into power and crushed by it. Her name was Julia the Elder, daughter of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. She was, by birth, among the most privileged women in all of Rome. Raised in marble halls beneath painted ceilings, daughter of a man who reshaped the Republic into empire. But even as the daughter of Augustus, she was never truly free. From the moment she could walk, Julia was a political instrument. Her education was elite Greek literature, Roman history, moral philosophy. She was witty, intelligent, well-spoken, and entirely at the mercy of her father's ambitions. Imagine her growing up in the Palatine Palace, the scent of cypress trees outside the open courtyard, the click of sandals on mosaic floors, tutors around her, always watching, every word refined, every gesture trained, not for self-expression, but to become a flawless imperial bride. At age 14, Julia was married off to her cousin, Marcellus. He was young, promising, and he died just 2 years later. She barely had time to grieve before she was married, again this time to Agrippa, Augustus's trusted friend and general, a man at least 25 years older. It was a politically perfect match. Agrippa gave Augustus 5 grandchildren through Julia, securing the imperial bloodline. But Agrippa, too, died, and again Julia was a widow. Once more, her father chose a husband for her, Tiberius, his stepson and heir, cold, rigid, and reclusive. Tiberius had little love for Julia. The union was strained from the start. This time, something changed in her. Perhaps it was grief, or exhaustion, or rebellion. The stories say that Julia began to seek comfort in other arms-secret lovers. Late-night meetings, whispered poetry exchanged in garden shadows. She was clever, charismatic, and unafraid to bend rules, perhaps a dangerous combination for a woman of her stature. But Rome was watching, and Rome did not forgive easily. When news of her affairs became public real or exaggerated, the Senate turned against her. Augustus, the father who had used her as a tool for decades, was suddenly scandalized. In a brutal act of political theater, he banished her. She was exiled to the island of Pandateria, barren speck in the Tyrrhenian Sea. No visitors without permission, no letters, no comforts, just the wind, the salt air, and the silence. Imagine her there, wrapped in thin wool against the sea breeze, watching the horizon as the empire she once belonged to receded into memory. The daughter of an emperor, alone on a rock. She remained in exile for the rest of her life, unforgiven, forgotten by the very people who had used her loyalty as currency. Her tragedy is quiet but profound. Julia was intelligent, cultured, and full of spirit. But in Rome, even the most privileged woman could be punished for stepping outside the lines. Her lovers may have faded into legend, but her fate reminds us of something sobering. In the grand mosaic of Roman politics, even the emperor's daughter could be shattered. And so, the tides of courtship in Rome didn't just buffet the poor or powerless. They could turn on anyone, where or brilliance. Even Julia didn't survive Roman courtship. Now, let us slip into something quieter, more elusive. Beneath the loud political marriages and dramatic family alliances, there existed another world, a hidden realm of stolen glances, coded messages, and forbidden affection. This was the undercurrent of Roman courtship, a secretive, subtle dance-off, just as complex and dangerous as the power games of the Senate. Roman society thrived on appearances. Public decency, virtue, and discipline were loudly celebrated. But behind closed doors, desire found its own strange pathways, and where laws were rigid, creativity bloomed in whispers. Picture a young Roman woman walking through the forum. She's veiled, of course modesty was expected. Her chaperone walks just behind, but if you look closer, there, in the way she adjusts her sleeve, in the flick of her eyes, an entire message might be hidden. Roman lovers often communicated through symbolism and gesture. A dropped flower, a scratched message in wax. The positioning of a hand at a banquet. These were tools of expression in a society that discouraged direct romantic pursuit, especially for women. Letters played a large role, too. The wax tablet, a simple, portable tool, was often used to pen love notes. But with literacy not guaranteed, such messages were a privilege of the educated classes. Some included verses of poetry or coded metaphors drawn from myth. You are my Venus, and I, your Mars, or my heart is more Roman than the Tiber. These notes were passed with care. A servant might deliver one in the folds of a cloak, or a musician might sing a verse at a gathering, his melody chosen for a single listener in the crowd. Even gifts held double meanings. A small mirror might be a declaration of infatuation. You are all I see. A hairpin might imply intimacy. Let me touch what others cannot. A ring engraved with initials might signify loyalty or invitation. The poet Ovid wrote of these subtle methods in his Ars Amatorio, the art of love, though satirical in tone. His verses reflect real strategies: how to catch a glance in a theater, how to read a lover's silence, how to write without being caught. But Ovid's books themselves were dangerous. His art of love was considered too suggestive, too corrupting for Augustus's moral vision of Rome. Eventually, Ovid was exiled, just like Julia, for what he vaguely described as a poem and a mistake. And yet, even in exile, Ovid wrote of love. This culture of romantic secrecy extended even into ritual and divination. On certain festivals, like the Lupercalia, young men would strike women gently with strips of goat hide, believing it would increase fertility. In other rites, girls would write the names of potential lovers on leaves and cast them into streams, watching which one floated best. There were amulets and charms, too. Inscribed gemstones thought to attract affection or fidelity. Perfumes made from exotic resins, worn not just for scent, but for symbolism. And yet, all of this existed in a constant state of danger, because Roman love, outside marriage, could easily become scandal. Even whispers of impropriety could ruin reputations or invite punishment, especially for women. For slaves, it was even more fraught. Any affection they showed could be punished, ignored, or exploited. Their desires were often invisible in the record, their voices lost but no less real. Love in ancient Rome was not a matter of freedom. It was strategy, it was theater, it was survival. So when we imagine Roman courtship, we must look not only at arranged betrothals and public unions, but at the quiet resistance of longing. The ways people found to express their hearts in a world that didn't make space for them. A world of codes. A world of risk. A world where even a glance might mean everything or end everything. Let us now rise from the hidden corners of love letters and secret glances and ascend into the grand halls of Roman aristocracy, where marble pillars, golden goblets, and carefully woven togas shaped the stage for an entirely different kind of courtship. Among the Roman elite, marriage was rarely ever about love. It was a negotiation, a legal alliance, a contract not just between individuals, but between entire families. And in this sphere, affection was secondary to status, wealth, and influence. Imagine you are the daughter of a powerful senator. You've been trained since childhood, not in flirtation or romantic fantasy, but in how to manage a household, navigate court intrigue, and bear children who would continue your family's legacy. Your betrothal might be arranged before you reach your teenage years. Your husband, possibly a man twice your age, wealthy, well-positioned, and selected by your father for reasons of political advantage. You would not meet alone. There would be no candlelit walk, no shared moment in a garden. Instead, you would be discussed, evaluated as a dowry, a connection, a legacy. Your role was to be silent, modest, and fertile. And yet, in some cases, elite Roman women learned to use their position to influence events behind the scenes, whispering in their husbands' ears, arranging alliances of their own, even engaging in subtle forms of resistance. The expectations of elite men were different, though equally structured. A young patrician might be groomed from birth to pursue political office. Marriage, for him, was another rung on the ladder. A wife who could host salons, impress visiting dignitaries, and bear respectable heirs was invaluable. Courtship in this world was often a public spectacle. Banquets might serve as an introduction to potential spouses. Families might make quiet inquiries into a young man's political ambitions or a girl's reputation. Gifts were sent ahead, rings, brooches, bolts of fine fabric, and always a carefully measured dowry. Weddings themselves were grand affairs. Trumpets sounded, processions wound through the streets, and offerings were made to the gods. The bride was escorted to her new home in a ceremonial passage, where she touched the hearth and was welcomed into her husband's family. And yet, for all the ceremony, there were quiet truths beneath the surface. Marriages could be cold. Affairs were common, though differently tolerated depending on gender. Women, expected to be chaste, could be shamed or exiled for transgressions. Men, particularly the powerful, often faced little consequence. Some elite couples, of course, did grow to love one another. Letters from the period show tenderness between husbands and wives, genuine affection and partnership. But such closeness was the exception, not the norm. Courtship in this upper echelon was almost never about attraction. It was about positioning. The system was deeply patriarchal. A woman's agency was narrow, though not absent. Some wielded soft power through influence and intellect. Others, like Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, shaped the empire itself from within the domestic sphere. Still, the experience was often alienating. One could live in marble luxury and feel entirely powerless. And so, while the poor Roman citizen faced hardship and danger in matters of love, lack of privacy, legal barriers, and social limitations, the elite faced a different kind of struggle, one of performance, control, and a loss of personal choice. To be courted in the Roman aristocracy was to become part of a strategy. It was to smile through an agreement, to recite vows written by others, to wear fine fabrics while your heart remained unknown. A gilded cage, some might call it, wrapped in silk, attended by slaves, surrounded by the scent of man. Yet, your future dictated by scrolls inked in distant rooms. Now, as we draw our journey through Roman courtship to a close, let us ease our thoughts and retreat from the weight of togas and temple oaths. And so, our journey draws to a close. From the humble alleyways of Rome's crowded insulae, where secret love bloomed in the shadows, to the grim realities of marriage as transaction, through whispered poems and borrowed gods of desire, and into the polished marble corridors of the elite, where love was often sacrificed at the altar of legacy. You have now walked through the layers of affection, obligation, and negotiation that made up the Roman concept of courtship. What may have seemed like romance at a glance was, more often than not, a carefully constructed path paved with expectation, structure, and frequently disappointment. Love, when it came, was accidental or miraculous. For those born into modest means, love could be fleeting, constrained by class, property, and the unpredictability of Roman life. For the wealthy, it could be distinto formal partnership, dressed in gold and marble, but cold to the touch. To be courted in ancient Rome was to play a role in a much larger performance scripted by fathers and priests, lawyers and poets, and rarely by the hearts of those involved. Yet, in the quiet moments, away from the eyes of society, perhaps something else stirred. A stolen glance, a hand touched beneath a table, a line of verse slipped under a door. These were the sparks, small, flickering, that might, now and then, break through the cold mechanisms of Roman love. Tonight, as you rest, far from the clamor of Roman forums and fading oil lamps, let your thoughts drift gently. Let the dust of the past settle into dreams, and take comfort in the distance between their world and yours. A world where love may still be complicated, but is rarely dictated by a father's forum speech. Sleep now, surrounded by silence, by stillness, and by the soft hush of forgotten histories. Good night.